It is 3 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get the session started. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the last session of today, and it is Reimagining President Truman through a museum transformation. And our presenter today is Mark Adams, who's the Education Director at the Truman Presidential Library and Museum, and he's going to talk to us about this 5-year process that they've just gone through to reimagine their exhibits. So welcome, Mark, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. As Chris said, we've been going through this project at the Truman Library for about the last 5 or 6 years, and some of you have seen some previous presentations about that. What I wanted to do today was certainly show you the bulk of what I'm going to show you is images from the new exhibit that opened in July. But also to some of the thought process that were behind it that I think museum professionals would appreciate hearing, and maybe can learn something from us, the good things, the missteps along the way and the good things along the way in going through this process. And so we not only reimagine the museum, but we actually kind of reimagine the Truman legacy as part of that as well. So let me share my screen. I appreciate your patience and thank you for coming into this session this afternoon, and I'll get the screen share going here. And we are going to take questions at the end, so you can put those in the chat and we can grab those at the end of the session. It's a little harder to do that while you're running the presentation. So there you can see the title there, so hopefully you can see that screen. If you can't, I'm sure someone will let me know that you can't see it.
We can see it.
Thank you, Chris. And along with, a lot of times when you go through these renovations and real complete redo really of the whole museum, a lot of other things come along with it, like branding and things like that. And so it just so happens we decided to come up with our new logo as well, that you see proudly displayed on the caption there, and then that was then featured on the banners that you can see on the front of the new museum entrance. Let me say a couple of things about that before I kind of dig in. Just kind of logistics really of the Truman Museum, because we are currently closed again at the moment, like many museums. Some have opened, some have closed, some have stayed open. We did open in July. The project finished in July that I'm going to talk about here this afternoon. But then towards the end of July, because we're a federal museum and federal agency through the National Archives, we did actually close after 3 weeks because of increased COVID numbers in Jackson County. In late summer. We are hoping to reopen soon. I can't really give you a date on that. Staff just actually went back this week, so that's a good sign. The staff are now back in the building, about 25% of the staff. So just the logistics of that, hopefully we can reopen maybe before the Christmas break is our goal, but all of our guidelines come from the National Archives and from the CDC. So at the moment we remain closed. So the one way to see our exhibits at the moment is through this presentation. And as I mentioned, the title is Reimagining Truman Through Museum Transformation. I've been at the library long enough that I went through our last renovation in 2001. And some of the things I'll say today may be comparing that transformation then to the massive undergoing that we went through in the last 5 to 6 years. It was a $29 million project. And let me share with you some of the partners and some of the people involved in this, because I think that's fair. And I think that you might want to know who some of these folks are. So the exhibit design itself was done by Gallagher and Associates. They're out of Portland. Clark Anderson, the architects, they're in Kansas City. Monadnock Multimedia. I've done multimedia components for us before. They're up in New England. The exhibit fabrication was done by 1220, and they're in Nashville. And then, of course, we have the staff content team. And although there I list our head curator, the archivist, and myself, we did have our support staff supporting us along the way, particularly the archivists and the museum registrar in particular were very helpful identifying documents and photographs and three-dimensional artifacts as we went through that. Let me say some about the process too. As Chris mentioned, it was more or less a 5-year project. So we started in a very typical way with different groups that we brought together to brainstorm about what we would want in a new museum. Initially, the original plans really more like 6-7 years ago were just to upgrade the exhibits. and not necessarily transform them completely. But as more and more discussions took place, it was evident that we needed to basically start over, literally start over and tear out all of the old exhibits and bring in, build new exhibits. As that went forward, some key things started to come together that some of the groups agreed on. And, some of them are very basic, and nuts and bolts, and others were more imaginative and out of the box thinking and real creative solutions to some of the things that we identified kind of through a SWOT analysis, really, the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats that the museum had, and how to improve that for a 21st century audience. So the title of the exhibit we're going to get to is An Ordinary Man, His Extraordinary Journey. And so really to look at Truman's roots, his background, and really kind of unique, when you think of presidents since Truman, not many of them have come from such a humble background as President Truman did. And whether he succeeded or not, we would argue with the thesis for our exhibit, he certainly went on an extraordinary journey. And so that's not necessarily putting him on a pedestal, but certainly some of the events that unfolded, some to his doing and some that were just forced upon him, he certainly faced an extraordinary journey to the presidency, and then when he was president for 7.5 years. So the exhibit talks about his whole life, and that's a key thing that I'll come back to as we go forward. And so some of the things we wanted to look at, and I think this is probably the most important slide as it puts it all into context. On the left are the things about the museum exhibit itself, and on the right are some of the things that are going on in terms of the visitor experience, almost not really matter what the content is, but some of these things that needed to be introduced into the museum. So let me take a glass of water first for a second. Sorry about that. And let's talk about the material on the right, first of all. It was certainly, as I mentioned, the last renovation of the museum was about 20 years ago. And so certainly there was a need for upgrade of technology. And to be honest, that's where some of the first conversations started. Not necessarily redo the whole museum, but just to upgrade the technology, with the onset of flat screen TVs and high definition images. Our older monitors and older video programs were certainly showing their age. And so that was one of the things that continually brought up. And of course, the older materials were harder to replace parts and things like that. We wanted to give, through these focus groups and different groups that met, staff, volunteers, community members, teachers, board members, and so on that were brought in, there was a big call for give opportunities for feedback, to give visitors a chance to engage with us and give feedback, not just on the exhibits in general, but maybe on some specific issues. And so I'll show you some examples of that a little bit later on. Not to say that we didn't have that before, but it was in a more rudimentary way through comment books and things like that. We certainly wanted to continue interactive exhibits. We already had some interactives, but certainly the technology increase in museum world, with touch screens and things like that, certainly pointed us towards that. But we also wanted to keep, tactile, manipulative interactives as well. So we wanted a balance of kind of electronic and non-electronic interactives. Certainly we wanted more multimedia opportunities, not just for the sake of it, but some of the things that you can, tell the story of are easily done maybe through video. And we realized the appeal of that to a younger audience. And that was another strategy, was to get more of a younger audience into the museum. Over those 20 years since the last renovation, of course, we've collected new materials from both the archive side and the museum side, artifacts and so forth, and along with video as well. So we wanted to make sure that we highlighted some of those items, and I'll show you some of those a little bit later on as well. One thing that came up kind of as we went along, and not necessarily immediately, was to change the visitor entrance and the whole pathway through the exhibits. Those of you who are familiar with our museum, you would come in right by the Benton mural, and that would be the entrance. but there really was no flow to the exhibits from there. So we've moved the new entrance to the east side of the building and really closed off that entrance where the Benton mural is. It's there for special events and things like that. But now it's more towards the end of the exhibits themselves. And then finally, and the key point there was to have one exhibit to cover all of Truman's life. Previously, we had an early life of Truman downstairs, and upstairs we had exhibits that dealt with his presidency. And what we wanted to do here was to have one exhibit that covered all of that in its entirety. On the left side, though, thinking of Truman himself and his family, not just President Truman, we certainly wanted to include more about the First Lady and their only daughter, Margaret Truman, along with highlighting Truman's accomplishments, which we did reasonably well in the previous exhibit, but we wanted to delve deeper into that. And we felt like through some of the focus groups, they pointed out areas that were either dealt with in the previous exhibit in a short way, but maybe not in enough detail. We wanted to expand on those or even bring in things that were not mentioned previously. And some of those are positive things, and some of those are, missteps, like the steel crisis, for example, was not featured in the previous exhibit, but there are examples of that in the new exhibit where you can see where Truman oversteps the mark and the Supreme Court overrules him on that particular case. So that gets to that next bullet about acknowledging mistakes or missteps or failures, not completely, of course, not to the detriment of accomplishments, but maybe take a more balanced approach. Presidential libraries and the presidential library system is often criticized sometimes in some of the newer libraries for being a shrine towards their president. And we really had that in mind. And although we wanted to highlight his accomplishments, we wanted to acknowledge areas where Truman overstepped or didn't succeed. And that goes into the next point about providing multiple perspectives and the latest scholarship too. So it's not just a case of collecting materials over the last 20 years that are new, but also there's a lot of new scholarship in that time period as well. And then the final point that came back and back to us over and over again was to make Truman relevant to today. And I'm sure many of you faced that with your own museum of, relevance is really important to get a younger audience into the museum and to connect to them and to their lives. So that was a real key point as we went forward with the exhibit design and the exhibit script. So lots of things to take on. I don't know if we accomplished all of them. You come and judge for yourself when we reopen. But that was what we had in mind as we took on this mammoth task. And so there we see the front of the museum that we opened in July, closer up image of what you saw earlier with the new logo on the banner. And there we have the Navy band playing. It was a small opening because of COVID, but we did open in the beginning of July. And we've learned a lot just in those 3 weeks that we were open. We unveiled this statue of Truman that you see in the foreground. And then at the lectern, there is actually Truman's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, his oldest grandson, came to help us with the opening of the museum in the first week of July of this year. So I mentioned that we changed the entrance. That was the new entrance on the east side of the building that was built onto the museum. And then when you turn into the museum, you come into a new hallway and gift shop and ticket counter. And then you would turn to the left, and this is where you would enter the exhibit on the left, and the entrance to the exit to the exhibit is on the right. And you'd stay on this level for the entire exhibit. And as I mentioned before, it was split over the 2 levels. So downstairs, we're going to have 2 special changing exhibit galleries in the lower level instead of the 1 that we had previous. So the first thing you'll see is a 3-minute what I call a stand-up video. And in the discussions for this, we wanted a video to start things off, but not a video about all of Truman's life, not a video that covers everything. We wanted to drop into a period of Truman's life that was the most dramatic and would help set the story to look at the rest of Truman's life. And be honest, we went back and forth about this for the longest time. And we decided upon, and the photograph is misleading, we decided upon the most dramatic day for President Truman was not necessarily the decision to drop the atomic bomb, though some could argue that, but we went with April the 12th, 1945, and that's when FDR died and Truman became president. And so this 3-minute video tells that story. So it starts in the previous summer, and you see the posters there, Truman for vice president, at the Democratic Convention in the summer of 1944, where Truman eventually becomes the vice presidential candidate. And of course, it wasn't guaranteed that he was going to be able, that he was going to win the nomination, but he does. And then the video goes very quickly through the next 6 to 9 months. So it pauses in November for the 1944 presidential election, when FDR wins his 4th term and Truman is elected as vice president. And then on to the inauguration in January of FDR and Harry Truman as president and vice president, and then quickly to April. And then the video freezes with the announcement that FDR has died and Truman has become president. And it finishes with footage of Truman, video footage of Truman taking the oath of office, very grim White House, as everyone is shocked by the death of FDR. And then it poses a question for the rest of the exhibit. And the question is, what in Truman's past prepared him for the presidency? And so that sets up the entire exhibit then. And we really feel this works incredibly well, because then when you go to learn about Truman's backstory, his early life and so on, you're doing so with this reference that he's going to become president. What prepared him? What in his previous life, what happened in his early life prepared him for the presidency? So we're kind of a unique way to bring ourselves into the exhibit, and then we can now go back to 1884 when Truman is born in Lamar, Missouri. So this is kind of a big semicircular video screen with quotes floating on it and so forth, and people raising doubts about whether this unknown man from Missouri was ready for the job. And then we go into the exhibit itself, which you can see a couple of photos here on the left and the right. Some of them kind of overlap here. And so the early life is done so in the context of this question. I've repeated the question there at the bottom of the slide, but it's what in Truman's past prepared him for the presidency. So as you're looking at these exhibits about Truman's early life, you are doing so with this question in mind. And so that was a new approach for us, to kind of have this thematic question that would bring you into the exhibits, and was done so deliberately. And you see other questions posed throughout the whole exhibit. As you go into each new area, there's a different question posed, but this one really deals with the whole exhibit. And then you can see some of the artifacts there. He was known as a child, he's a proficient piano player, and the exhibits here talk about his early childhood, his education, and how important that was to his mother, and his early life on the farm, and his family. There's a family tree represented there. And I'll talk about the tower in the middle on the next slide in a moment. But we do get into his early relationship with Bess Wallace as well. So you see a couple of snapshots of the exhibits there. And then in the center is this letter tower. And I think this is a really unique design that Gallagher and Associates came up with. And it really allowed us to kind of have a showpiece at the beginning of the exhibit that's very dramatic, very eye-catching, and gets that wow factor that you want at the beginning of the exhibit. And these letters are all copies of letters that Truman wrote to Bess Wallace before they were married in this section of the exhibit. And as you may know, a lot of you know that we have approximately 1,300 letters from Harry Truman to Bess Wallace during their lifetimes. And they're all in our archives. And in fact, they're all digitized and all on our website as well. But this really allowed us to highlight this rich content that we have in our archives, and then samples on the table in an interactive format on the table. You can look at flip books, you can look at the cost of postage and some of these other things surrounding letter writing and the technologies of the time. And of course, it gives us the opportunity to look at Truman's own words. He's telling us about his time on the farm. He's telling us about his teachers when he was in high school. He's telling us about what's going on in the 1910s and the 1920s in his letters to his future wife. And this section of the exhibit, though, we do not have letters from Bess Wallace. She destroyed those. But later on in the exhibit, in the 1920s and 1930s, we do have some examples of some of the letters that she didn't destroy. So a very dramatic beginning, and it's surrounded with interactive content. And so on the left side here on this white wall, and you might just be able to make out the title kind of embossed in the wall, and it's called Lasting Impressions. And so these are things from Truman's early life that left an impression on him. And you can just about make out there's a piano keyboard, there's a crank for the car, that's the black lever to the bottom. There's a pair of glasses that show you why Truman had to wear glasses. And I've got a couple of other images here to give you a sense. This whole wall is interactive, and this is in the same room where the letter is, and you can see the family tree in the background as well. And this is another look at that Lasting Impressions wall with the piano keyboard. And down on the very bottom, there's a little frog that you slide across. One of Truman's earliest memories was seeing a frog hopping around on the family farm and things like that. So it's a really cool interactive wall that it's designed for all ages. Many of us think of interactives just for young visitors, but this was designed for all ages to look at. Although I think the example photograph I have is of a cute young lady looking through a magnifying glass to look at some of the smaller artifacts in more detail. And you'll see throughout our interactives are both electronic and tactile. And that was deliberate in nature, not to go completely electronic, but have some manipulative interactives as well. And then we move on to 1917, and where world events took over Truman's life. Now, we dealt with World War I in our previous exhibit, but certainly not to the extent that we do now. So this is one example of one of those areas that's been expanded, but also we've kind of, in a way, altered the thesis a little bit here in that we really look at how World War I shapes Truman's life, gives him really a lesson in leadership as he's put in charge of Battery D, and a real tough battery to deal with. And then you can see some of the original artifacts related to his life there, the uniform and the binoculars and sewing kit and things like that. And there's a whole slew of those in the cases in this particular section of the exhibit. There's also a multimedia piece too. And so you see the screen there at the back, and then some of our replica artifacts in front of the 75mm gun and caisson, and this replica muddy field that 1220, the exhibit fabricators, put together for us. In fact, our engineers thought there was a leak in the ceiling when they were looking at the mud and the puddles in this area of the exhibit when it was first installed, but it's fake mud and a fake puddle there in the scenery. And then the 7-minute video plays over the top of that in the background. I will say that this is not a video about all of World War I. It's deliberately designed not to tell the story of all of the war, but to tell the story of Truman's experiences in World War I and how that affected him throughout the rest of his life. And so that's where that's featured there. So again, not the whole story of World War I. We have another museum in Kansas City that takes care of that very, very well. Instead, we just look at Truman's experience and his movements and his experiences during that time period. So he goes from Oklahoma to New York to fighting in France. And he's the only president to serve in combat in World War I. It has a profound effect on him. And then in that area too, I mentioned these different interactives. This is one of those latest technology ones that we're really excited about. Truman had to train to fire the 75mm guns, the French guns in the war, and then also direct his troops to fire them. And he actually went to special training in France when he arrived to learn how to do that. And we have an interactive that sets that up for visitors, and it's both tactile and computer based. So you'll see the wheel in the foreground that you would turn. And when you turn that, it changes the turret on the computer screen. So it changes the angle that you fire the guns. And then the levers on the left and right are to set the charge either low or high, and then to actually fire. And so it's both a mechanical interactive that visitors can turn the wheel and press the handles, but then it also interacts with the computer screen to see whether you hit your target. And you get directions from Harry Truman himself. There on the bottom right corner, you see him on the telephone giving you orders of the angle to aim for and whether you've hit the target or not. So a really cool interactive that makes the best of the latest technology there. And then we move on, post-World War I, Truman opens his haberdashery store there on the right. You see these interactive drawers that you can pull out and learn more about the haberdashery clothing store that he opened with Eddie Jacobson. And on the left side is more about his family. Of course, when he gets back from France, one of the first things he does is to get married. And then about 5 years after that, they have the birth of their daughter, Margaret Truman, and that's what's featured in the exhibits at the back of that photograph there. You see the stroller, the pedal car and tricycle and some of the clothing and so forth. And really, Margaret Truman didn't get a whole lot of attention in the previous exhibit. And this is just one example of that. There are other exhibits that feature her life too. And then we move into the 20s and Truman's connections to the Pendergast family when he becomes the county judge or county commissioner of Jackson County. And then we move on to the Senate years and the role Truman has in the Truman Committee. There's a couple of interactives I wanted to point out here. The one on the left has these cogs that you turn. So as you turn the one on the right with the red circle, it changes that one, but it also changes the one up above. And that one is about the different pressures that are put on him by the Pendergast family and how he responds to that. And then the second one is more of a tactile map where you can lift the pieces out. And this is when Truman is in charge of the Truman Committee, looking at wasteful spending and the run up to World War II, wasteful spending by the Defense Department. And he is the chair of that committee. And as you lift up each part of the map, as you can see, there's a little handle there on Texas and New Mexico. You lift that up and it shows you examples of wasteful spending that Truman uncovered in that time period. So just a very simple interactive, but one that I think is going to be really popular. Then we move back to where we started with the video in April 12th, 1945. We're dropped in again to that point where FDR dies and Truman takes the oath of office. And then what we see is those first 4 months that face Truman after he becomes president in 1945 of April, May, June, July, and then ultimately August. And we all know what's going to happen in August. As you go through each of this month, there's a vertical timeline. You can see the red and black bars coming down. Each section has newsreel footage and video from the time period of all the different things that are going on in that time, and then a featured artifact in each of those areas as well, as Truman faces all of these things at once. So in May, Germany surrenders on May 8th. In June, the United Nations is created in San Francisco when Truman goes there and delivers an address. In July, Truman is in Germany meeting with Stalin and Churchill at the Potsdam Conference. And while he's there, there's the successful testing of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. And then in August, he has to authorize the decision to drop the atomic bomb. And that races through that, and then it features exhibits related to the atomic bomb at the end of this hallway. And the two featured exhibit artifacts, when you come down there, and I'll show you how they're displayed in the museum on the next slide, but I wanted to show you a close-up. These are two of the smaller artifacts in our collection, but two of the most significant. The one on the left is the safety plug that was in the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, that was taken out by the engineer, Mr. Ashworth, and he brought that and delivered that to the Truman Library in the 1990s. He had kept it all of that time. And on the right is a paper crane that many of you are probably familiar with, the children's story, 1000 Paper Cranes, that was created by Sadako Sasaki, who folded 1000 paper cranes as she was suffering from radiation sickness. She ultimately died, but her brother carries on her story, and her brother donated one of those cranes to Clifton Truman Daniel, Truman's oldest grandson, and then he passed that on to the library, where it's now displayed in our new exhibit. And you'll see on the left the safety plug in the center of the room in a cylindrical case with the information about that and the tag that came with it. And then on the right, you'll see highlighted, and it's very small, the cellophane crane folded and donated to the library to represent those that died because of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the wish for peace. So those two artifacts juxtaposed against each other in the same gallery really help us tell the full story with other information, of course, around the exhibit gallery. As we come past that, and after the Japanese surrender, we go, and this, you'll see this particular photograph was done while we were still installing the exhibit. So this is not the final way it looked, but it's kind of neat to see it being installed. We have a 14-foot high globe that shows all the problems in the world that Truman faced after the war was over. And on 3 sides of the globe, you see video projections of newsreel from all over the world with people on strike, unrest, rioting, people starving. You know, Europe and Asia, really the entire world is devastated by World War II, by that 6 years of fighting. And these videos, the newsreel, show you what that looks like in 1945 and 1946. You can actually step inside the globe on the reverse side, where there are 3 touchscreen monitors where you can examine 6 different families from around the world with the touch of your finger on the screen. So you can investigate Chinese families, Japanese families, American families, European families, and so on around the world in 1945 and 1946. And you can take that as deep as you would like. And that's really utilizing the latest technology there. It's a really cool feature. And then one of the things I mentioned at the outset was we wanted a way to gain teacher input. And of course, in this part of the gallery is where we deal with the Marshall Plan and the introduction of that by President Truman and Secretary of State Marshall, where they introduced the idea of foreign aid. And so what we have here is a touch screen and a keyboard, and they pose the question there that's on the screen: do you think foreign aid is necessary to promote US interests? And we've got 3 of these stations around the museum exhibits that relate to the various exhibits surrounding them. And so in this one, we're looking at whether foreign aid is necessary, and you can share your response, you can explore the responses, you can type in your own comments, you can comment on other people's, you can like other people's comments, and don't worry, the staff can curate this in case anybody decides to use bad language or unnecessary comments. We have a way to control that appearing on the screen as well. But it's a really cool interactive feature, and we've got 3 of these with 3 different questions, and we have the option of changing out those questions as well on the back end. So I thought that was a really interesting way to get visitor feedback about particular issues, and you can connect it, of course, to modern day events and that idea of relevance. And then in that area, there's a video that looks at the beginnings of the Cold War, and that's using projection mapping technology, where the projection, there's about 6 projectors in this area, and it can project onto 3-dimensional surfaces. So this area is meant to look like rubble in Europe, of a devastated Europe, and then the video projection changes and goes on all of these different outlines. You can see one piece of rubble is in the shape of Europe, highlighted there on this screen. There's a window frame there on the right which changes, and then in other areas of the rubble, you get the projection can show on those as well. This video is narrated by George Stephanopoulos and goes really through the beginnings of the Cold War and the Berlin crisis in 1948. And there's another shot of that. If you look carefully on the right, you see Truman in the window frame, and then the entirety of the screen filled with the United States flag. It's a really wonderful piece of technology using this projection mapping in its highest form to get across the beginnings of the Cold War. In that area, of course, we deal with the Berlin crisis in the exhibits, along with the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine and so on. I wanted to show you the Berlin airlift piece, particularly because of some of the technology we use there. So we have the cutout of a plane fuselage there with a photo on the wall, and then the different sections of the fuselage either give statistics or videos or photographs, and then there's a touchscreen table as well to the right. I've got some other images of that close up. So there you see some of the statistics there. It took 2,000 tons of food per day to feed the citizens of Berlin and so on. And then the table I mentioned, there's a close up. This is a touchscreen table that looks at Germany and really the logistics and the statistics surrounding the Berlin airlift, what it took. And to activate this one, you don't do so with your finger, but you do with what we call a hockey puck. You can see them just on the left of the young lady's shoulder, and she's holding one too. It's like a three-dimensional disc, and it has a chip on the bottom, and that activates the screen, and then you move that around the screen. You can even turn it to activate more questions and more information. So highly interactive that more than one person can use at once on this interactive table. So again, trying to make the use of the best and the latest technology that's available to us. And this has some animated pieces within it as well, and where it's very, very popular. One of our local teachers from Independence kept saying how cool this particular section was. So I'll take that feedback all day long. And then there's also a station there too, individual monitor, to learn about the story relating to Gail Halvorson, the candy bomber who dropped candy to German children at that time as well. And there's a dedicated video just about his story. And then we move in another episode in 1948. This is in the next gallery, is Truman's recognition of Israel. And we have a 7-minute video here. And again, using some of the latest technology. Let me go to the next slide. Here, the LED lights surrounding the screen change colors depending on the nature of the exhibit. And it's red when it turns to war and so on. So a real, very dramatic video piece. And as I should have mentioned before with some of our other video pieces, we use a lot of National Archives and Truman Library video footage to create these different videos throughout the exhibit. But very dramatic exhibit with all of these LED light strips and so on surrounding the video screens. And again, using that projection mapping on the different shapes and the triangles and diamonds and the different shapes that you see there on the screen. Then the exhibits themselves in that area, we have, of course, information about the displaced persons and the timeline leading up to the state of Israel. This is a very controversial decision. Some of Truman's own cabinet members were against it. And so we represent those, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And then there's some of the gifts, the artifacts that were given to Truman at the time and then later in his life as well by different Israeli dignitaries. And there's the close-up on the displaced persons and the background information. And this is what I was aiming for. This slide shows you a flip book. And in this one, instead of it being Truman's letters, in this case, we have letters back and forth on opposing viewpoints related to Truman's decision or the way he's leaning towards recognizing Israel. So the letter on the left says the Jewish people have absolutely no moral or legal right to land. And then the one on the right, we absolutely approve of your new plan and so on. So you'll see this contrast in letters in a couple of different areas of the exhibit to show the different points of view surrounding decisions and not just to put the positive viewpoint there. And we do this here, and we do this with civil rights as well when we come to that in the next gallery, which is next. Good segue. We deal with Truman's civil rights message also in 1948. That was a very busy year for Truman, where we look at the story of Isaac Woodard and how he was beaten in his army uniform and blinded, and then the role of A. Philip Randolph, and then Truman himself calling for the Committee on Civil Rights and ultimately integrating the military through the Executive Order 9981. There's also a video there narrated by Emmanuel Cleaver. I think that's another area that didn't get much treatment in the previous renovation, and we've certainly expanded that. You're just seeing one slide of it here today, but there's certainly an expanded piece on civil rights and how it ties into the 1948 election, which is on the next slide. And you see a video on the back of the train here. And I've got a little caption there, new color footage. That's just to remind me to tell you that we did discover some color video footage that was shot from the 1948 campaign train that we had not used in an exhibit before. And so that's part of a 6-minute video that's narrated by Truman's grandson that goes through the whole Whistle Stop campaign in its entirety. So a great piece there, surrounded by, of course, artifacts and other exhibitry. There you see the famous Norman Rockwell painting, the family squabble, where the family are fighting over the candidates in the 48 election, along with some of the campaign buttons and other things relating to the election. And there's that famous Dewey Defeats Truman newspaper as well. We can't have an exhibit about the 48 election without that. And then we get into Truman's second term and his domestic agenda through the third deal. And these are a tactile interactive also. Those gray panels in the middle, those flip over and you can see what happened to some of these initiatives later in Truman's term or even after his term. So if they were not enacted, well, did LBJ take it on or did another president take it on in the future? Things like civil rights, minimum wage, national health insurance. And so you see these different issues and how they're dealt with. And you see that relevance to today as you look at these kind of in fast forward mode, what happens in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s with these issues after Truman's left office. As we get towards the end of the exhibit, we have a multiplayer interactive on the computer screen there where 6 people at once deal with the loyalty oath and the Red Scare, and I've got a close-up of that. So are you a loyal American? And it poses these questions to you about whether you're a loyal American in the 1950s in an interactive gameplay, which visitors have really enjoyed. And so then we move into the Korean War. Of course, that breaks out in the summer of 1950 and really dominates the rest of Truman's term. We have a 6-screen video wall related to the Korean War itself, tells the whole story. And then we have exhibitry with a timeline of maps. And what I really wanted to show you was some of these new uniforms. There's 5 different uniforms here that are new collection items. A Korean War Museum in Illinois closed, and we managed to secure that archival and artifact collection, and we're able to put those uniforms on display for the first time. And so we're really excited to share that with everybody, including on the right there, a prisoner of war uniform. And then we get back to our old main entrance, where the Thomas Hart Benton's mural was protected throughout the entire process. And now we have a new interactive touchscreen technology that you can explore the mural touching the screen there, and it tells you more about features on the exhibit, on the painting that you can explore throughout the whole mural, and also the relationship between Thomas Hart Benton and Harry Truman as well. And then the surrounding that are Truman's return to independence with video and exhibits about Truman living back in independence again. And then the final area is where our old gift shop used to be. And that's another thematic area. The other was Truman's in Independence. This is the Truman's in Washington. And this primarily deals with the White House renovation, because of course that took place during Truman's second term, and they're living out of the White House for about 3 years. And you see a White House beam from the White House here, and some of the other artifacts. That's a fireplace that was in the White House. And then there's a touchscreen interactive for that too, where you can explore the photographs taken by the National Park Service of the whole renovation. And you can even pop those up on a larger screen so other visitors can see what you're looking at. And then finally, around our book stops here, sign and Oval Office exhibits that do remain, we have new exhibits that deal with the 3 branches of government. So the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. And there is an interactive on the legislative branch that looks at how a bill becomes a law. And we use Truman examples for that. And then as we get towards the legacy section, you see Madeleine Albright and Kofi Annan, President Obama, President Bush, and different quotes. And then this table that was used by Truman to sign the Truman Doctrine, but was also used by Madeleine Albright at the Truman Library in 1999 when NATO was expanded. And so we have an artifact that tells a story of Truman's legacy also. And then we get towards the end and Truman's death. We still have his gravesite in our courtyard along with the First Lady. And you see a political cartoon there as Truman rises the steps. And then we see photographs of Truman as a farmer, a soldier, a businessman, a politician, and at the end, a grandfather. And then a quote on the wall to finish. Mrs. Truman and I hope and believe we've contributed to the welfare of this nation and to the peace of the world. And there's my email. I will stop the sharing. I think we're right on 3:46. I'm 1 minute over. And there we go. So I will be gladly take any questions in the chat. If you have any, I'd love to answer them.
Mark, that looks like a really powerful exhibit overall. You mentioned that the one teacher already provided some feedback. Have you heard from others? What reaction are you getting from your?
Yeah, as I
your
said, that's a great question. We were only open for 3 weeks, but in that time, I mean, everybody was super positive about the new exhibits. They were blown away. A couple of our own docents, they're sometimes the toughest audience to please, said it was like walking into the Smithsonian exhibits in Washington, D.C. I don't think there's much higher praise than that. They're seen as kind of the gold standard by many. The Oval Office, yes, we still have the Oval Office. I didn't show that today. And his office that he worked in, those are both still the same. The Oval Office actually has changed a little bit. The rail going into the Oval Office has bumped a little bit more into the room, so you can get a little bit closer into the room than you could previously. His working office, which you get access to from the courtyard, has not changed. It's the same. So you'll be pleased that those permanent features. I laugh when I tell visitors there's 4 things that didn't change: the Oval Office, his personal office, the Benton mural, and then my punchline is the 4th one, the grave sites. We didn't move any of those or change any of those. I'm sure you're very relieved to hear that.
Did you have quite a few discussions, and did you struggle at all with tackling the part about the bomb?
Yeah, so what we decide to do then, we do this with a lot of tough things, Korean War also, is we lay the information out, but really don't reflect an opinion. And then we leave the opinion to the visitor. So we just kind of like we do with our research room, we make the information available, and then it's up to the visitor to make up their own mind. So we do have a comment book there in a more traditional format for people to write their comments. And we have a tactile interactive like note cards, like index cards that you can post on a wall with different questions, not just the atomic bomb, but other controversial things. I do see the question, can you explain the walking Truman logo? I assume it's associated with him being known for walking around Independence. Yes, that's right. He walked all around Independence. He did the same thing in Washington, D.C. Secret Service hated him for doing that. He'd take off on his early morning walks, even when he was president in Washington, D.C. But yes, he was very well known for his his walking and his, many of the people in Independence think of him with his walking cane as he walks. And in fact, the Independence tourism uses a very similar silhouette for historic sites around Independence. The question is, what led you to include more of Truman's failures, mistakes? You know, you go through there, it's going to look very praiseworthy of Truman, I have to say, but there are examples of that we can point out. I think we're very cognizant of some of the criticism. There was a New York Times article in the last decade, I can't remember exactly when, where it talked about some of the newer presidential libraries being shrines to their president. We're very fortunate in that we're an older presidential library, and the oldest living relative is a grandchild. If you've got a presidential library, and let me choose one Republican and one Democrat, to be fair, if you've got a presidential library like George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, there's one on each side, they're both alive. It's harder to do full interpretation when you've got a living the living president is still around, or their spouse is still around, or their cabinet members are still around. That's not the case with Truman. You know, all of his cabinet members are gone now in the last 10 years. The last two passed away. His daughter died in 2008. His oldest living relative is his grandson. Now on the board, doing the fundraising that the Truman Library Institute did all the fundraising and rose above, they went above their $29 million goal. To do that, they had to say, you know, we're going to tell a great story about President Truman and so on. But when it came to the label writing, for example, when we wanted to do an example of the judicial branch and the Supreme Court, we used the steel crisis as the example to show where Truman went too far and the Supreme Court ruled against him. When we look at the legislative branch, we look at where Truman vetoes a bill, the Taft-Hartley bill, and Congress overrides his veto. So those are two areas where we show balance of power, right, between in the three branches of government. And we've used really examples where Truman's overstepped the mark and how they reined him in. With all of your touchable interactives, which look amazing, how does the pandemic impact how those can be I get what you're saying. With pandemic, what you do about touch screens and interactives, you're right. Right now, we have a protocol of our cleaning crew are going through the quite frequently to wipe everything down. When we opened in July for those 3 weeks, we're almost nostalgic about it now. We had time tickets and a limited number of people were allowed in the galleries at any one time, which allowed us to control that flow. And you know, the 1:30 group had gone through so then our cleaning crew would be able to come through before the 2 o'clock group arrives, if that makes sense. You're all museum people, so you kind of know how that is as the group progresses through the exhibit. And it is kind of a linear exhibit, really. You go through it in one flow. There's one path to follow. So the cleaning crew were able to come in behind each group, because I think we were allowed, if I remember correctly, 36 visitors per hour with our time tickets. So as each group went through, cleaning crew would come behind them, then the next group of time tickets comes in after that. So that's how we manage that. That might be a little different when we reopen, because they may allow us to have more people per hour and more people on each time ticket slot. So that's something that's under consideration, but we do have a pretty robust cleaning crew going through and taking care of many of those items. Great question, and one we've talked a lot about internally.
Thank you, Mark. This has been great. I can't wait to see it. Looks like there's several museums I need to hit in Kansas City that have been redone, so I can't wait to see this one. Amanda, are you there? Amanda Langendorfer?
Yes. So my name is Amanda Langendorfer. I'm proud to be currently serving as the president of MAMA. Mark, thanks so much for a great presentation.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, this has been pretty fantastic. Like Chris, I cannot wait to go see it. I've been kind of eagerly awaiting the reopening. So, so thank you. Thank you for coming.
You're very welcome.
Give us a sneak peek today. So I was hoping, or I'd like to thank everybody for attending our conference today. We have had a great slate of sessions. Some very phenomenal speakers and some really wonderful topics that are so relevant to our museum community today. As a reminder, today's sessions have been sponsored by the Missouri Humanities Council, and I'd like to thank them for their support of MAMA. I also wanted to bring a quick attention to some things I want to make sure don't get lost. We have 2 pre-recorded sessions. I'll post these in the chat so you have them readily available right here if you want to click on them. One of them on Wednesday, we're going to do a brown bag lunch. You can join our own Christopher Gordon here to discuss new collecting initiatives at the Missouri Historical Society. But first, to kind of prep you for that, we've put together, or there has been a program with Truman State University professor Dr. Huping Ling on the Chinese American community in St. Louis. So she's talking a little bit about her research in St. Louis, particularly related to the Chinese American immigrants. And then Chris is going to talk about, or talks about in the recording, the collecting initiative. So you can join Chris tomorrow during lunch to ask questions and to get more information. Also, we have another brown bag lunch on Thursday. This is the collaborative from some of the art museums here in Missouri. And this is Missouri Remembers, Artists in Missouri through 1951, which was a project done in honor of the bicentennial. It was a joint partnership between the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the Kansas City Art Institute, and the St. Louis Public Library. So if you go ahead and you make sure to watch that video first, we'll have some of those participants, those partners, join us on Thursday for a brown bag lunch too. So sessions begin tomorrow at 10 o'clock. We'll start off with the St. Joseph Museum experience that talks about an internship program that's designed to promote diversity in the field. But before that, hope everybody can join us tonight at 7 for a virtual happy hour. This is a great opportunity just to get together, have some informal conversations and a good time. So I really hope everybody can join us for that. And I think that's it. So Chris, you want to conclude?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And I hope to see everyone through the rest of the conference and or the happy hour tonight. So enjoy.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.